I'm going to have someone else with Hancock Whitney come up and speak. Mr. Josh. Jones, sorry.
Good morning, and welcome to Hancock Whitney Bank's Economic Insights Luncheon. My name is Josh Jones, and my banking partners and I want to thank everybody for being here today, and thank Roger and the board for allowing us to make this presentation, which we all believe is very timely, as it's something that consumes us on a day in and day out basis. You are our customers and our partners in the community, and because of you, Hancock Whitney Bank maintains #1 deposit market share in St. Mary Parish, and that's something that we're very proud of. We also maintain #1 market share in Lafourche and Terrebonne parishes, and that's something that we strive to build and work towards every single day. We achieve this through a one-bank approach of professionals managing your relationships. One group of banking professionals in the wealth and investment bank, in the retail bank, and in the consumer bank, working together for you, the client. We thank you for your business, your friendships, and your relationships. And now we're going to introduce our speaker.
Okay. Mr. Steve Morgan is a Senior Vice President and Investment Director at Hancock Whitney, where he facilitates a team of investment professionals focused on delivering superior investment strategies and client outcomes. Stephen has been in the investment industry for over 25 years. He joined Hancock Whitney as part of the acquisition of Capital One Asset Management. Prior to joining Capital One, Stephen worked at Morgan Stanley, efolio.com, Hibernia Bank, and Waterhouse Securities. He has a Bachelor of Mathematics from Carleton College and a Master of Mathematics from the University of Wisconsin. Please welcome Mr. Steve Morgan.
Thanks so much. So we were driving in from New Orleans this morning, and I was on my phone, as people are wont to do, and checking out LinkedIn, everybody's favorite social media site, and one thing caught my attention. Ray Dalio, who made a lot of money as a hedge fund manager, decided to go on and post something from his book, 2021 book about sort of cycles of nations, and he wanted to republish his chapter 5, which is about stage 5 of the evolution of nations, and that's where he said that we were today. Unfortunately, stage 6 is civil war, so I'm kind of hoping that the news is a little bit better, but in fact, that's not even the craziest thing that happened on social media in the last 7 days from a policy perspective. So what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what we see going on in the economy, what that might mean for markets, what it might mean for business owners as we go forward. Since I have some of my colleagues with me, I will pause on the disclosure to point out that the opinions I express are my own, not theirs, not Hancock Whitney. Everybody will deny ever having met me if you don't like what I have to say. So the other disclaimer that I will take just a moment to point out, but two really. First of all, as was mentioned, I'm in our investment group, our asset management group. We manage investment portfolios, stocks, bonds, funds for both high net worth families, multifamilies, as well as institutions, corporations, municipalities, foundations, etc. And that's important because that's going to help you understand the perspective that I am bringing to this presentation. When I'm looking at the economy, I'm looking specifically at what are the things that may be important for markets, what are the things that may be important for business owners, for our clients, as we navigate through some pretty choppy waters at times. The other disclaimer is that I'm going to have to talk about a little bit of DC, or a lot of DC, because it has become ever more important in what happens inside of markets, as we have seen. And so, let me say a couple of things there. First of all, I'm sure a lot of the people in this room have an opinion about what should happen. You don't get this much gray hair without realizing that Wall Street doesn't really care what I think should happen. So my job today is to take a look at not what policy recommendations I would make, but instead, where do we stand and what are the likely outcomes? Markets, green, Wall Street, that we're looking. Let's make sure that we bring it to attention. Hopping in, we've got inflation. That had core CPI, the red line, and have come back. But there have been some other changes that happened, and whether it's the lollipop guild or somebody else, the labor force has that. Here, they want a job, they don't have it. Down to pick you and went to the back, found something there. Well, for a long time, that blue line after COVID was above the red to fill those jobs. And so my designation at the time was, look, it's really hard to get a deep recession if that's no longer the case. It's come into balance, and that's going to be important to understand. How do we develop from here? It's been a pretty good run. This is up through the end of 2024. We had a little weakness right after COVID, but for the most part, as we started that recovery in 2021, we've seen numbers that were really good for the U.S. A large, developed economy, very diverse. But we saw numbers 4, 5, 6% early on, and have been running well above that sort of 2 or 3% that you might expect most of the time. But we did get a little bit of weakness in the first quarter, not maybe as bad as we expected. There was a little bit of shrinkage there. Initial read was about 1/3% shrinkage in GDP. But there was some oddness going on there as well. A lot of that was triggered by people trying to get ahead of Washington policy. There were already rumors, even though we hadn't gotten to Liberation Day yet, that tariffs were going to be coming in. They were coming in hard. We already had some that had been declared. People were trying to get goods into the country as cheaply as possible. And those goods, although they're partially offset by an inventory build, really eroded away at GDP. We also saw some odd figures around shrinkage and some kind of government spending, et cetera. So we think that actually is, on the whole, probably a good number and sets us up for some reasonably good numbers the rest of the year. The one thing that I'll point out, the sort of the noise of the thing that people don't always remember, is I said CPI, that inflation rate is coming down. One of our research partners here, and there's a lot of lines up here I know, has done a different kind of breaking out of inflation. And rather than saying, I'm not going to worry about energy and food, because those are volatile, the problem is we used our air conditioning on the drive over here, right? We used, we ate along the way. People like to eat. People like to keep their houses cold or warm or whatever it may be. Therefore, they split it out to say, what are people really spending their money on, have to spend their money on, versus what could they spend their money on? And that red line is the have to spend. And the third one down, kind of a blue line, is the employment cost index. That's essentially how much money households are making, and this is compounded over time. So rather than just looking over the last 12 months, it's gone up 2.4%, whatever else. Households still aren't able to buy as much of those have-to-haves as they could before. or if they're buying the same amount, they're doing away with a lot of discretionary. Of course, that changes a little bit as you go up and down the income spectrum. But this is going to be an important figure for us to watch, because the next thing that's going to happen is really a focus on consumers. Consumers are about 70% of the U.S. economy. Again, as long as there were lots of jobs, then there was no problem, right? Even with inflation, people were going out and spending. But now that those jobs are kind of coming into balance, not that there's a shortage, but there's a little bit of a balance there. Consumer confidence has been shaken. This is the University of Michigan study on how good consumers are feeling about things. You'll see that that level is down below where it was in 2008 during the great financial crisis. It's just about to the level it was during the depths of COVID. People are worried, and in fact, some of the other pieces of the survey, consumers are expecting inflation to come back gangbusters, really in ways that are untethered from, I think, any reasonable expectation. Consumers are expecting something like a 7% inflation rate over the next 12 months. I'd say that this was the most important graph, but the fact of the matter is, people say one thing, but, we're Americans. We like to keep spending as long as we can. And so, just running 2023, once we get sort of COVID out of the flush through the system, this has been the growth in personal consumption adjusted for inflation. So, you've got some sort of total amount that's being spent by consumers, by households in the economy. And that red line is just the average over this period. You'll notice consumers started to step away, but they were doing that early in the year. They started to come back a bit. So we're starting to see consumers really saying, yeah, we're going to keep spending. We're going to keep at it. The question, maybe this is the most important graph. That's going to be the question that we want to keep watching. Is how good do people feel about continuing to go out and spend the money? Well, they're probably in pretty good shape, right? We've got a low unemployment rate, a little bit higher than it was a year ago, but not significantly. And credit card default rates are trending back down. They're lower than they were before the great financial crisis. And about a year ago, I was worried because that trend line was heading back up, right? People paid off a lot of their credit card debt with money from the COVID relief, but then started to default on their credit cards again. And I would have said, well, if this trend continues, we may have a problem with the consumer, but that's slowed down as well. People are in better position to continue to pay their credit cards, to continue to meet those obligations. So, the basic line that we have here is the U.S. has been on pretty strong footing from an economic perspective, but what about policy? Well, this is a measure, one particular measure of economic policy uncertainty from policyuncertainty.com. They measure, really, it's about news reporting, the percentage of news reports that mention things like recession, etc. You'll note, again, these are higher than they were during COVID, at least in part because there were a lot of stories happening during COVID. It wasn't all about the economy. There were other things happening, but people are feeling fairly uncertain, and that's really where it's matching up with what we're seeing in those consumer sentiments. People don't quite know. And of course, that spiked up in April. What was there? Well, we've been talking since the November election about the 4 pillars of the new administration's policy, the Donald Trump squared, the DT squared policy, with deregulation, tariffs and trade, deportation of the border, and tax and spend. And we thought that those outer columns were going to be the most important, the most profitable for growth, right? Lower taxation, more reasonable spending, deregulation, helping to ease some of the burdens on industry that were really going to help growth get along. Tariffs and trade, deportation of the border were primarily risks that we saw, at least in the short term. But of course, we know that that has changed And deregulation is a tough thing to do. It was the most important item in the first 100 days of the first Trump administration. But this is a graph of just the total of pages of active regulations in the federal code. In the 50s, it was under 20,000. It's now approaching 200,000, and it's very hard to sort of roll those back. So we do expect that regulation will happen. There's been some important developments on that front, maybe from an environmental standpoint, which is to say, for example, maybe most importantly for a lot of folks in Louisiana, the lifting of LNG licensing and the push to expand that. Oil and gas production is a little bit less clear because the Saudis and the rest of OPEC are going to be producing more. There's not necessarily the same price incentive to produce there, although the regulations are going away. Importantly, I think, just 2 weeks ago, I think, the Supreme Court did make a judgment that should help in this regard. It was about a rail infrastructure that had been proposed and was going back and forth. There had been several lawsuits saying that the government agency that conducted the environmental study didn't take into account enough of the effects, right? So environmental groups were very pro to get that in. The Supreme Court essentially said the agency can decide what its environmental requirements are going to be. Those are not going to be as challengeable, so it may well accelerate, along with aid from the new administration, the kind of quickness of some of those infrastructure projects. It will make it far easier to get major infrastructure in place for oil and gas, for other kind of items, which takes us to the next page. The other big news, of course, tariffs. Now, they're not as important, imports are not quite as important as they were in the late 90s and early 2000s, but they're a lot more important than they were in the 30s and 40s. But we're seeing tariff rates at all those tariffs that we've got announced were to go back into effect, probably levels that we haven't seen since the 30s. So the era when tramp steamers were the primary vessels of international naval trade, this was the kind of tariff rate that we saw. So it's become an important piece and certainly a negotiating tactic for what's going on. There are lots going on within this, and I'm going to talk about sort of 3 different things that tariffs can be used to do. The first is kind of as a leverage in negotiations around other policies. So we've seen, for example, maybe the very first tariff threat being leveled was against Colombia, who was refusing to accept some deportees into the country. And so tariffs were threatened, Colombians backed off, so it was just a tool being used to accomplish some other goal. Then there's the 2 economic goals. One is to raise taxes, i.e. more revenue to the government in the form of tariffs, or 2, to really protect and develop domestic industry. I think that those are both a little bit happening. We're seeing tariff collections start to ramp up. They were $11 billion in April compared to $5 billion the month the year prior, and $20 billion plus in May. So we're seeing a kind of rapid move up of those as some more of those tariffs come into effect. But the even better news from that perspective is the Congressional Budget Office did a study that estimated what would be the total effect over 10 years if the tariffs that were in place in the middle of May, so after suspension of some of those big reciprocal tariffs, if those were in place, it would raise about $2.5 trillion to the federal coffers over the next decade, which helps offset some of the deficit that we might see from taxing cuts and spending cuts. So if that's the goal, then it looks like we're on path for that. Unfortunately, of course, What the other piece that erodes that is the protection of domestic industry. And if people do start to buy domestically, then they're not paying tariffs anymore. And so there's a little bit of a trade-off, kind of getting the needle just right. And there has been a real push to develop some of those domestic industries. And one of the most important that we've been paying attention to is shipbuilding. The president, I think correctly, and so that's one where I'm going to say what should happen. Right? The president correctly identifies shipbuilding as a national security issue. U.S. used to build lots of ships. Now those are primarily being produced in Asia. Something like 50% of all commercial vessels in the world are being produced in China. The U.S. trade is limited, as people generally here know, to some niche products involved in offshore, things that are mandated under the Jones Act, other items that are important. However, the president did sign an executive order directing the various agencies to put together a series of plans to reinvigorate shipbuilding in the United States. And that's going to be in the form of a variety of issues. First of all, an overall plan. Second of all, the creation of a trust fund, much like that is funding a lot of the highways, so that it's not the case that Congress has to go and approve something every single year. People that are trying to depend on those government programs in order to make the investment, in order to develop that, would be going on that particular item. We haven't heard a proposal about how large that trust fund would be. Just taking a look, call it something like 25 billion, possibly up to 40 or 50 billion, and it would be funded from a variety of sources. Again, it has not been specified, but another piece of that executive order directed the U.S. Trade Representative to create essentially a special kind of tariff on ships built and or flagged from China that enter U.S. ports. Now there is some risk to this. There's a little bit of disruption as people try to figure out what ports of call make most sense. If they're going to pay $1 million every time they stop, they're not going to stop at as many places. But that could be a source for some of the funding, as well as congressional allocation for that trust fund. That also, as I said, is a source of, well, hopefully people would start to order U.S. ships in order to avoid some of those port fees. All of that probably needs to happen through Congress. That's not going to happen this year as part of the 2025. It's probably not going to happen as part of 2026 because we're not going to get that full plan until November of this year. So it's something that we're keeping an eye on. Just as an aside, the MARAD Small Shipyards program was not touched in this 2025 sort of continuing resolution, has been expanded under the reconciliation. But there was an initial proposal to essentially more than double the amount being distributed and being made available through that program. I would not be surprised to see if that were ramped up to 3, 4, 5 times what we've seen in recent years. It's a very small dollar amount compared to the federal budget. So it's easy to increase, and it has sort of outside impact in terms of just loan guarantees, et cetera, from an investment perspective. So we'll be watching that. If those programs come together, I will say that Louisiana, because of both sort of the historic nature of expertise here, as well as some of the tax credits in Louisiana, is one of the places that should benefit the most from these programs. And so I think it's something that we'll want to keep on to see exactly how that plays out, because there's going to be lots of money, lots of people looking for the money in Congress. Once it becomes obvious, it's going to become available. But it is definitely a sign of, I think, things that could track pretty well for the state. Next up, the other two pillars, deportation. Well, we are seeing some protests around that in LA, as people are no doubt aware. This is, to our mind, a little bit of a risk. Things that could go wrong. Obviously, what we had seen until recently was, and what the administration had promised as a worst first deportation program, right? Get the criminals out of the country. And I think all of us would agree that people here illegally to do illegal things are not people that we necessarily want to have in the country. Getting rid of them is generally going to benefit both economically and socially the country. The difficulty comes as you get a more aggressive program where we have millions of illegal immigrants, undocumented workers, whatever your preferred term is, in economically critical industries in this country. So construction, pretty important driver for consumers, almost 14% of the workforce there is undocumented. If I look at drywall or plastering, that goes up about a third. Roofing, it might be as much as 40 or 45% of roofers. And that's, if folks self-report, fail to show up for work, or whatever else, there's not necessarily a lot of people ready to step in with that same skill set. And in fact, the people that are probably just going to demand a higher salary because there's going to be more competition for them. Everybody is going to look for their best economic advantage. Same thing happens in agriculture, where we've got people that are kind of critical in the meat processing and other pieces of the industry. It can be managed, but it's likely to be inflationary, at least in the short term, if the administration does move as aggressively as they promised. It's something that we're watching. It's something that could kind of cause some pain for consumers, which might cause them to step away. If their housing costs go up another 20 or 30%, even fewer families would be willing to buy a first home. Good news is, from a market perspective, everything is working this year. Bonds helped us get through that April turmoil where we dropped. We really got from the top late last year to a 20% drop and then immediately recovered to near our all-time highs. Bonds have happily been paying interest as they were not 10 years ago, so that means that savers were benefiting from that. Bond owners benefited as well, so we've got positive returns going on there. So what are we watching for? What happens next? Well, I'm going to open this to questions because, again, people with a lot of brains sometimes do a lot of talking, and I've done a bunch. But in sort of the closing piece of what I wanted to say is there's going to be a lot of drama coming out of D.C., whether it's Elon Musk, whether it is a standoff with China, whether it's the current tax and spending bills that are in Congress, where the House and the Senate are marking to different levels and don't necessarily have agreement on some key policy choices. And there's a debt ceiling coming up that we really probably need to address by the end of July. I don't think we're going to get there before July 4th as promised, but we might be able to get there by the end of July. We certainly need to deal with the debt ceiling. Lots of things happening over the next several months that will cause markets to spasm, as we have seen. They will start to move off and then come back. I was encouraged by the latest sort of announcements about steel and aluminum tariffs that markets reacted but did not spasm in quite the same way. We didn't see a 20% drop, we didn't see a 5% drop. They reacted and moved back. Similarly for threats against the EU and against Apple in particular. But lots of economic news. Some of it's going to be bad over the summer, just through the nature of the beast. However, all of that is coming on a foundation for the U.S. economy and U.S. consumers that is very strong. So our expectation is that yes, there's some turbulence, markets will go up and markets will go down, but that as we move into the second half and into the first half of next year, those economic numbers start to brighten a bit. We start to see some of the policies become clearer. We also see some of the policies start to have some of their positive effects and not just the immediate short-term gain. So, again, strap in, put your seatbelt on for the next few months, but as we move past that, lots of good things to potentially happen in the quarters ahead. And with that, I'll pause and see what questions you have. Yes?
What's the local, South Louisiana outlook? This is nationwide. We got the Chevron case, we got this other things, and I just wonder what you thought about that.
Sure. So the question is, great, all this is national. What about us here in South Louisiana? And you're right. So last term, the Supreme Court overturned the Chevron precedent, which was really directed courts to defer to federal agencies, executive agencies, about the scope necessary to enforce their mandates. So that also is a source of some uncertainty because nationally, because different districts can come to different conclusions about that. So you're going to have to get some cases that go up to the Supreme Court for them to create some greater clarity. But for the immediate outlook, I think there are lots of good things. The shipbuilding is a major piece. The fact that infrastructure that supports ports can be put in place is a major piece. And then the third, again, is just the LNG production, which a little bit more, but that overall natural gas production itself should benefit the U.S. There is a possibility that some of the restrictions on foreign oil that have been proposed, including levies against nations that are buying from particular countries like Russia, could help support some domestic spending on production, but probably not as significant. So I'd look for, in the energy sector, more infrastructure than necessarily production. So. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Not necessarily the debt ceiling, but just the debt in general. What's your opinion on the effect of the overall debt on the country's economy, and whether we should be more concerned about that or not?
So we should. So let's be clear. Yes. The question is, what about the overall debt level of the federal government, which you could probably extrapolate out to some other sectors. But let's go on that. It is projected to grow to about 120 under some measures, depending on how the bill works out for reconciliation, up to 125 or 130% of GDP from where we are today, about 100. So that's not good. We're already feeling the effects. As interest rates have come up, good for bondholders, bad for the federal budget. We're spending more money on interest payments than we are on discretionary defense or discretionary non-defense. Now, it's not the total discretionary budget yet, but we're moving pretty close to that. So the total spending is being rapidly accelerated by just the fact that we've got to continue to spend this. We saw Moody's do a downgrade. We've seen other bond markets start to get pretty nervous around potential for an expansion. If bond markets get nervous, the price of borrowing money to the government goes up. So we are definitely at a point where we need to start acting. The good news from my discussion just with some folks kind of behind the scenes in DC is that certainly the people in Congress that produce the legislation are aware of this. The policy wonks are aware of this. The elected officials won't necessarily admit to being aware of it in all cases, but a lot of them are starting to talk about it, right? It's a major piece of why are we really going to expand the deficit as much as some projections say with the reconciliation bill. So from that perspective, they're aware there's probably going to be some sort of joint bipartisan committee formed to make some recommendations. But the important thing to recall here is really the only path forward is some sort of reform on non-discretionary, some sort of entitlement reform. One of the things that's being proposed, which I think is likely to get some traction at some point, remember that there's a cap on how much income is taxed for Social Security purposes. That could be raised or go away entirely. There's also some options to play around with retirement age and what that means. That becomes more complicated because it's one thing for somebody like me that spends a lot of time at a desk. It's something else for somebody that climbs around on a roof or in a refinery to work to 67, 68. So definitely something that I think we will see get addressed. The bond markets are starting to insist. We passed 14% as the magic number of interest payments as part of the federal budget, and that really does historically represent a trigger where we go from austerity, or we go to austerity from sort of relatively easy spending. So I think we're getting there. It's going to take us 2 or 3 years. The problem is we're starting to see some things like the highway fund and trust fund run out, and so got to act in the next couple of years if we're going to get there. Good. Other questions? All right. Well, we got a few minutes. I'll be around. But everybody's got to get back, so I'll turn it over. And thanks everybody for your time.